Good evening and welcome to Africa's Vision Network. Africa's Vision Network features African cultural awareness, economic empowerment, spirituality, religion, education, and other issues on the African world. I'm Raymond Thompson, your host and an African living in the diaspora. Today's program will focus on investing from a layperson's point of view. Our guest today is Mr. Jonathan Clark. This young man is an investor. He's been investing for a few years now. And we'd like to start out by asking a few questions. First off, welcome to Africa's Vision Network.
Thank you.
How did you get started with investing?
So investing really started with outside forces. I didn't know anything about it. My immediate family didn't know anything about it. So friends of the family were really what helped me kind of gain a realization of what it actually was. Okay. And from there, it was just, trying it, seeing it, and seeing what I can get out of it.
Interesting. Now, was it difficult at the beginning to free up money? Because one of the biggest concerns most people have with investing is that it's not a sure thing.
Right.
You put your money into a venture, and it's not guaranteed that that ship will come in. What allowed you to be able to invest what money that you had available and not be as concerned about it?
Well, the first time I begun to invest, I was a kid. So I was around 15 years old. And, I didn't have a job at the time. So the money I was getting was from birthday money, Christmas money, maybe allowance, that type of deal. And it's hard for a 15-year-old to basically put their money where they're not getting something back almost immediately. That's just something that we don't do. Like, kids will not do that. But what made me keep up with it was the fact that it was interesting. The interest of potentially gaining more money and getting more out of it was high for me. But there was that risk factor. So it became quite interesting to see, what I could get. And I think that's what kept me going, is just seeing if I could actually grow with it.
I think probably another factor too would probably be you have the security of, having home.
Right.
And so something that, say, an adult would be kind of concerned about putting money out there that they could potentially lose when they have so many other responsibilities. So
Right.
that's a good time to really start at a young age. Now, I know myself personally, I was probably maybe close to 26 when I first got interested in investing. I had a gentleman that I worked with who was a mentor. If you looked at him, he looked like, an average working class person. But he owned part of an industrial park complex, and he also was heavily invested with a investment company.
Right.
And he was not interested in climbing economic ladders. He worked just because he wanted to have something to do, and he was in his 50s, I think it's very important to be able to understand that there are other dimensions out there that we typically aren't exposed to in our education system. Now, did you have any type of classes in high school and investing?
I absolutely had 0 classes. I had not one. High school was the general liberal arts programs that you take, your science, your maths, your English, your social studies or history, and college was pretty much the exact same way. And you had maybe your accounting class here, or you'd have a business class there. But ultimately, there was no schooling, like none at all. And I think that's something that made me a little bit more fearful as I got into my 20s. Because while I had that safety net when I was 15 and 16, I didn't when I was 21, 22.
Right.
And so my level of investing dropped off significantly at that time.
You had expenses, bills to pay, et
Right.
cetera. Well, it's interesting. Now, do you have any other friends in your age group that also share your interest in investing?
I have some who started when I started and didn't like it, faced some risk and said, I'm gone, I can't do it anymore, I don't want to. I have others who started, it dropped down for a little bit, and then they picked it back up like I did and are still doing it to this day. And then I have a number of people who just don't understand it and want no part of it, because we live in a cycle today where pretty much everybody associates stock market with either risk or gain, and more people are more likely to align themselves with risk rather than gain because of what we see on today's news cycles.
Well, it's interesting too, talking to a number of people about investing. We're going through a time, not just in America, but in the world, where because of technology, the security that we had with jobs at one time, that's not a sure thing.
Right.
You talk about working for a company for 30 years, retiring with a pension. That is becoming less and less the reality. You'll have a thrift savings plan. If you participate, fine. If you don't, you're on your own.
Right.
And so many Americans will retire with Social Security, which won't be enough to meet their demands and such. But I find that there is a lot of, I say, negative feedback toward investing because it's associated with greed.
Right.
I think, from my perspective, I feel that it's one of the vehicles that you can employ to achieve a certain amount of stability. But I think that you can invest without money being your God, per se. I think if you're doing it for having stability and opening up options for yourself that stability will give you, I think is a good thing. What's your perspective on that whole issue? You hear it sometimes even from religious leaders,
Right.
where people who these leaders have their ear will tell people, don't talk about money. It's just a negative thing. Is it money that's evil? It's a resource, or is it people's love of money above principle? What do you think? What's your perspective on that?
Money has this weird association with, guys in business coats walking down Wall Street and taking from everybody else and kind of putting it in their pocket. And while that may be true in certain instances, it's actually true for everybody. Everybody has the opportunity to basically create something for themselves that will grow. And it can be as little as $5 to, infinite amounts. I think the problem we have today is that we consume news so fast. And part of the things that come out is it's not unlikely to hear a news story about how something's crashing. Or it's not unlikely to hear a news story about how some major business person has stolen from somebody else, or how some company is taking advantage of their workers. And so when you hear that, and then you hear about the stock market and people's stocks going up and down, you almost kind of associate the two. But what I think a lot of people don't realize is that there are millions of people out there who have their own personal accounts that can be attributed to the stock market. And so I think it's time for us to kind of hang back and see all the information and realize that people from millennials and beyond can take advantage of that and actually make something work for them. I think we need to really kind of take the evil out of it and take the stereotypes out of it and really kind of move forward, because there's a lot to be gained from actually studying that.
Well, it's interesting. What you said brings to mind an analogy which an author spoke of in a book I read, where he compared abundance to someone being at an event where there are 5 plates and 5 people. Well, if this person takes 3 plates, 2 people come up short.
Right.
Okay, they've got their plate and a plate for 2 others. And that's the way I think a lot of times money's looked at when you're looking at it from the perspective of some folks having too much. People believe that there is a set amount of abundance, and that by you having these 2 extra plates, other people aren't going to be able to eat at the table.
Right.
I have come to believe that that is not the case. That unlike that situation with the dinner plates, there's an infinite amount of wealth. China as a country has more billionaires than anyone else in the world. By me discussing other people's situation, what they have compared to mine, it doesn't help my situation any. One of the things I think that's very important that needs to be discussed in a sane manner is what individuals have to do in order to be able to provide for themselves and their generations in the future.
Right.
I often hear a lot of discussions about loss. Well, I can't afford to lose money. You know, one of the things that you see throughout communities is we buy a lot of items that are high ticket items like automobiles. Cars depreciate really fast. You know, if you buy a Buick now, you're going to spend probably $35,000, $40,000 for the car. 5, 6, 7 years later, that same car you can probably get for 15,000.
Right.
So for those who are risk adverse, I say, well, you're losing anyway. Why not put some of your money into areas where there's potential growth? Now, when we talk about stock, you mentioned earlier stocks going for $4 or $5 a share. Have you been able to buy stocks for those prices?
I have, especially after the 2008 fiasco, right,
Okay.
where
Downturn.
the economy had a major downturn and people were really afraid of just putting their money anywhere. You started to see, if you really looked, you started to see a lot of people actually get into the stock market at that time because things were low. I've bought things that were as low as $1.
Okay.
And I've gotten things that were higher than that. But it's interesting to really take that look and see. The things that are low, I think, helped me when I was, especially at that age, you know, my mid-20s, was because essentially $1, $2, $3, it's like, all right, that's not that bad, right? If I lose it, all right. It's the things that are 50, 60, 70 bucks a share. That's when you start really kind of getting into a situation where people really start to associate major loss and they don't want to lose anything.
Okay.
But I think something that you brought up earlier, we have this weird society where we like to compare ourselves to other people, especially millennials. I've done it. I'm sure plenty of people are guilty of doing that.
Human nature.
Something I think that really has a major impact, especially on our community, is the fact that when we compare our personal and our financial lives, that's something we don't like to do. We don't want to talk about it. And if we try it and it doesn't work for us, then all of a sudden, you know what, that's it, I'm out. And I think something like that where, you know, hey, I've put some money in the stocks, I automatically lost, so this isn't for me because I don't understand it. You know, that's a real thing that happens, and then people say, I don't want to try it anymore. But on the flip side, if someone has a nice automobile and you say, oh, well, that's a nice automobile, and you decide, I want to go get that, you can go to the car dealership that day, and because they want to sell that car to you, they're going to find a way to get it in your hands, and you can walk out that day with it. And I think that's the difference. You know, people can put their money into something and then take it back immediately when they shop. When you have stocks, you can put your money into it, but you can't get it back immediately. Right. Unless you are going to, you know, unless you want a loss. And so I think that's something that really plays a factor. It's the patience.
Well, you know, I know one of the things that we see a lot across the African American community is oftentimes we get the short end of the stick. Sometimes we look at external factors which may be there and are there. One of the things I was always taught was life is not fair, and you have to figure out a way to make things happen. There are approximately 4 ways that you bring in the resource that you need to provide for yourself and your family. Once you get to a certain age, now how old are you now?
I'm 30.
30, okay, I'm 63. Once you get to a certain age, and it unfolds this way for very many people, 45, 50, you find yourself being sandwich generation.
Right.
You're taking care of young people on one end, then mom or dad or some significant senior in your life. They start having issues health-wise, and you have to take over for them and such. And maybe the resource you had was enough to where you could keep your head above water, but now all of a sudden, in one phone call, you know, you're struggling to make ends meet. So I think it's very important at the youngest age possible for young people to embrace economic empowerment. I think it's very important to have an idealistic goal for that also. Like it says in the Bible, for those who much is given, much is expected. You have to be willing to help others, and money shouldn't be your God. One of the things that I think is very important is to maybe get together in groups, be it in personal settings or even within our communities and some of our institutions in our communities, and discuss these things that include not just dealing with money, but also being able to pass wealth on to the next generation. Or when a senior gets to a point where, because their property tax is going up, because their city is getting to a point where there's a lot of building and construction take place, and all of a sudden they open an envelope up and it's like, oh, great, Dino, I can't pay this.
Right.
Being able to discuss strategies before people get to that point where they're round the bend and down the creek without a paddle.
But I think something that's important about that is we don't like talking about money. As just a human species, we do not enjoy it. There have been plenty of reports that talked about how coworkers don't like talking about their incomes with each other.
Yeah, it's true.
You get bosses who don't want you to do
Excuse me for
that.
interrupting, but even with parents.
Exactly.
The same parents that you're helping sometimes,
Exactly.
they don't want to
It's not
discuss their
something they
expenses.
want to talk about, and so it gets even harder, I think, especially for millennials, because like I said, we compare each other, and we compare ourselves to other people. So I think it gets really hard when you potentially see somebody who looks like they're doing better, and they may not be actually doing better, but it's enough where all of a sudden you might start to doubt yourself. And there's stuff like that where you don't want to talk about money. I mean, really, there are plenty of people these days. I have friends who will not talk about money with their own parents. I know people who won't talk about money with their own spouses or it's crazy. It's something that should be an open conversation, and yet we have a hard time doing it. These days, you'll find insurance companies and financial companies that are literally trying to start that conversation and are still having a hard time bringing people out. So I think that's one of the stigmas we need to get over.
Well, you touched base on something when you mentioned insurance companies. Oftentimes, when you talk financial management, it's believed that you're only talking about money.
Right.
There's another part of that where you play good defense. Good defense is, do you really need to replace items that you've already paid off? You know, if you already have a vehicle and you're trying to get other expenses out of the way, just because they change the external body shape, do you really need to have to go out and buy at this stage of the game the newest model they come out with?
Right.
Home ownership. Now, in the local metropolitan area, Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia, and Maryland, real estate has gone sky high. I'm originally from Lexington, Kentucky. I was home a week ago for Thanksgiving, and looking at real estate prices, you see homes going for $40,000, $50,000, you know, starter homes. I strongly suggest to young people, some family members, that they consider buying something, you know, and just getting it
Right.
off the plate as soon in life as you possibly can, because there are other things coming down the pike and such, including rising home prices, to where you're passing up opportunity. But one of the discussions that you see across the board in our communities is the subject of gentrification. Now, personally speaking, I look at our history where after 1865, black people who had been pretty much kept illiterate, but they were intelligent, they were able to go out and within 40 years had built cities, opened colleges that many are still in existence today. And they did it with very little as far as the way of academic knowledge. Today we have from A through Z, you know, from accountants to zoologists in our communities.
Right.
For some reason, we don't seem to be able to deal with what we call influx of other people. I think it's, personally, my slant on it is due to our lack of what to do with money to where it empowers us.
Right.
You know, buying a lot of items, you know, like they say, he who dies with the most stuff is still dead. Buying items that depreciate in value doesn't empower you, but also doesn't empower your community.
Right.
What do you think in terms of that whole concept of defense? You know, basically staying within your means. If you have a champagne taste and a beer budget, don't buy champagne.
I think part of the thing that makes people have a hard time with staying within their means is the thought process that we have to upgrade. The thought process that if something new comes out, then my stuff is automatically obsolete. And that's just not the case. But if you take a look at how we market things, especially to our community, we are a consumer community. That's what we do. We buy.
That's true.
And one of the problems that we have is that we don't stop buying. Now, it's not everybody. There's plenty of people who have realized that that's just the case and we need to kind of maybe tail it back a little bit. But there's plenty out there who need to have the latest iPhone, who need to have the latest vehicle and see what else is out there, who need to have the latest clothes. And that's where we start to run into trouble. And what I find is interesting is that you'll find somebody, and it's not everybody, so I don't want to kind of put that out like it is everybody, but you'll find people who will talk about how they just got the latest iPhone or they just got the latest, whatever designer clothes, but then say, well, I don't have enough money to invest, or I don't have enough money to look at potentially saving.
But you have $1,000
exactly.
iPhone.
The new iPhones are $1,000. I believe the new Samsungs are right around that same price. And yeah, you'll see people standing in line for that, right? You'll see people standing in line for shoes.
Right.
But how many people are really standing in line to get financial advice? It's just not something we're willing to do, it seems.
True. Well, it's interesting, going back to when I was in my 20s, I mentioned before, I had mentors. One gentleman, a friend of mine, I guess he was probably close to about 55 when I was 25. He'd been in Vietnam, came back, settled in this area. And he would talk to me about financial investing. And I would say, I don't have any money to invest.
Right.
And he said, Raymond, he said, I see your car all over town at these all-you-can-eat places.
Right.
You never know who's watching you. He said, Raymond, do you ever cook? I said, I know how to cook. He said, yes, but do you? He said, I don't mean to give you a hard time, but he said, you're a young single guy. He said, now's the time for you to put some money aside. Right. Well, I went home, and he mentioned to me, he said, Raymond, if you spend $10 a day, it's $300 a month.
Right.
Well, I tell you what, I went home, and I guesstimated what I'd spent during the last few weeks. I came out with an average of about $20 a day. That's $600 in 30 days.
Right.
I thought at the time, I said, gee, I forgot how to add and subtract. So I went to my briefcase, took out my calculator. I came up with the
same number.
And that was probably the small side of
Right.
it. And so I said, wow, I didn't realize I was spending that much. If you spend $20, even just $10 a day, you're spending anywhere from $300 to $600, a month eating out.
Yeah.
What I did, I knew how to cook when I was a kid. When I grew up, the oldest child always got dinner started before the parents got home, or else you were in hot water. So I knew how to cook. I just chose not to. So I started cooking, and what I did, I took some of that money that I was spending to make everyone else wealthy, and I started buying company stock.
Right.
It was $10 a share. They sold the company about 2 years after I purchased the stock. Stock I paid $10 a share for, they paid $55 a share for, So that was my first experience with actually realizing that you could make money without physically having to work for it.
Right.
Now, are you familiar with the 4 ways that we in America make the income that we use to exist? There are 4 approximate ways. First one is the employee.
Right.
The employee, you're taxed about 33% of what you make goes to Uncle Sam, Social Security, state tax, other taxes. Then you get taxed with what's left over after that.
Right.
You have the self-employed person who has a business they own. If they stop to go on vacation, or the business stops. If they become ill, the business probably will go under. You have a business person. That person has an entity which becomes self-existent. They hire qualified people to run it.
Yep.
Bill Gates can be in Africa helping with trying to deal with malaria and finding cures for this, and business will run just as fine in Microsoft whether he's there or not. Then you have the investor. The investor is open to all of those other 3,
Right.
And it's just a vehicle per se to allow you to be able to maximize your resource.
Well, I think something that can be looked at is there are so many people that just think of the employee, right? You go to school, and you're going to school to get that job. And once you get the job, you're getting paid by somebody, and that's it, right? You maybe you spend you get your paycheck and you spend some and you save some and that's it. But I think a lot of the issues that we're starting to see, especially with millennials and those who are coming after, is things like Social Security aren't really going to exist for us. You know, by the time I'm 65,
There are a lot of folks who want to kill it.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. You know, and say it is around. Say it actually still is around. It's not going to be that much, and it's not going to be self-sustainable. You're not going to really be able to live off of it. And so something that I think is going to be very important, especially for those who are, you know, maybe 40 and under right now, is having some kind of other income.
Right.
And that's where stuff like investing comes in. If you can make some money off of the stock market, which is available to everybody,
Right.
then all of a sudden you're opening up other avenues for growth. You're opening up other ways to potentially gain more money. And like I said, we have this weird stigma where only a certain type of people can do that when that's not true at all. Everybody can do it. And so I think that's one of the things that's going to be really heavily discussed, or has to be, in our community.
That was one of the things when my friend talked about investing. I said, well, I can't really afford to invest.
Right.
And by him making me see that I was spending a whole lot of money making Beefsteak Charlie's, Chesapeake Seafood House, Family Fish House. I love to eat. I was making everyone else rich, but wasn't helping me, you know. And in fact, I got to a point, I come to the door and they wanted to lock the door because I was getting them out of the house and home, you know. But yeah, I think these are the type of discussions we really need to have in our communities, because one of the things that I hear a lot of times is people's frustration and sometimes anger toward others. You know, in our community, the barbershop, the traditional barbershop, you go in, men sit there and they discuss issues relating to relationships, politics, what's going on in the news. I remember showing up in my local barbershop one day, greeting the gentleman. Hey, gentlemen, how you doing? Hey, Brother Thompson, how you doing? This and that. I sit down and pick up a magazine and start flipping through, waiting for them to call me up.
Right.
And the barber, he's like the gentleman, John McLaughlin in the McLaughlin Group. You know, he likes to get the conversation going. He said, Raymond, you're kind of quiet on this issue. I said, well, what's the issue? He said, they're talking about folks of European descent taking over a chocolate city.
Right, right.
Now, you know, playing the devil's advocate, I said, that's okay. He said, what? It's okay. You know, everybody stopped and,
Yeah.
What do you mean? I said, well, you think about it. You know, we wanted to have laws passed where we could live wherever we wanted to live. You can't say that someone can't move into your community because they don't look like you. I said, that wouldn't be right anyway, you know. But we don't have money to buy these. I said, well, some of us do and some don't.
Right.
I said, what happens is we move to different areas sometimes. You get population shifts. Areas like adjacent areas of Maryland and Virginia have become purple because of the outward migration of the black community into some of these areas.
Right.
But the concerns are legitimate. When I look around town, I see people who look like me who are out in the streets. They've been displaced by the rise in the real estate prices. It's not unusual. You look at some of the property management companies, they have their displays listed in the windows. You'll see a row house listed for $5,000 a month.
Right.
That's for the whole house. To rent rooms, $1,500 to $2,000.
Right.
You know, so people are being displaced. I think one of the answers for that is for economic empowerment to take place in our communities. It's not going to address the problem right now today, but if you start working on the next generation right now, that 10-year-old will eventually be that 20-year-old, and that time will come by so fast.
Right.
Doing stress tests where you can take someone who's my age, who's still living with a parent. Well, you're in a situation where it's not going to be too long before this person's not going to be in your life, unfortunately. And you're going, if you're depending on them, you're going to be out there.
Right.
You know, some of these things don't have as much to do with what others are doing, who are sometimes just trying to move closer to work or move into a place they feel that's attractive. I can't control that person or the situation that exists that allows them to be able to buy, and I can't. What I can do is I can deal with my own situation.
Right.
I can try to empower myself economically. I can also get people to work together as a group. Sometimes one person can't get it done, so it may require like a community concern and effort. The same way that I mentioned that our people were able, and within 40 years, to go from the field to having cities, Black Wall Street, Tulsa, Oklahoma,
Right.
Durham, North Carolina. All these places were built up with people having a coherent focus on providing not for themselves alone, but for the next generations.
I think one thing that kind of comes into play when it comes to that, though, is how has the information been passed down? We are in such a state these days where we literally do only know certain things. You go to school, you get a job, you save, and that's it.
Right.
And if that information, and it kind of speaks to what you were saying with communities, if that information isn't within that community, then all of a sudden it's not being passed down. It's just out there, which means you have to get it from someplace else. And how many people take that initiative, right? And I think part of the problem we have is, well, we'll start to complain, hey, wait a minute, I can't get in, or these people are taking what I'm trying to get, or these people are doing better. And we'll focus on those things instead of focusing on ourselves.
And I
exactly.
own it. Right.
And I think the problem that we face is that we focus on so many other things and we don't focus on uplifting ourselves. And uplifting ourselves isn't going to look like somebody else who's uplifting themselves, right? It's going to be exactly what you do. What you put in is what you get out.
Right.
But if you're not putting anything in, you can't expect to get anything out. And so I think one of the things that we really have to do, especially as we start to see what financial independence looks like, is take that information and continue to spread it around. And it goes back to that whole knowledge of we need to talk about money. We have to talk about investing. We have to talk about savings. If somebody's not doing that, then it's not going to be out there. And how's the younger generation, supposed to get that information if it's not out there?
You're right. One of the things I've experienced, I'm an ex-Navy guy. I left high school and went in the Navy, caught the first thing to smoke,
Right.
boom, and background in cryptology and some of those areas. And I quickly experienced something which I had been talked to about, but didn't understand because I never experienced. When I grew up in Lexington, Kentucky, I grew up in segregated school system. And in elementary school, the teachers used to say, you have to work twice as hard to get half as far.
Right.
And this is before you had civil rights bills passed, things like this. Well, when I went to Navy in '73, some of those attitudes were still existent. In the school I was in, I didn't realize that if you were black, you weren't allowed to be in certain job billets.
Right.
The Nixon administration under Secretary of the Navy Admiral Zumwalt, Elmo Zumwalt was his name, they passed a mandate that said from now on, regardless of color, if you can pass aptitude tests, you can go into any billet that we have in the Navy. Well, I quickly found out at 18 years old, some people didn't like that. Gentleman who was in charge of electronics school that I was in, he would say, you young people are the cream of the crop, the country's finest. But there's some people trying to change my Navy. Talking to some of the older guys when they had child, I said, well, who's trying to change the Navy?
Right.
They said, well, they laughed. They said, Kentucky, let me tell you something. You better cross every T and dot every I. They're trying to get you out of here. That type of attitude still exists in America where we come up against these glass ceilings, where you may very well train someone and you're working for the guy.
Right.
For a lot of younger people, your generation, I think my generation, we've fallen down as far as not passing some of this knowledge on to you. Not just you particularly, but your generations. Where you have to work twice as hard to get half as far. In many workplaces you go into, there are agendas that don't include you. And because of the way the history has been corrupted, there are folks who believe that you are intellectually inferior, not as capable, and the only reason that you got in there to begin with was because someone made some type of accountants for you to let you in. It's more important, what I'm getting at in this roundabout way, for us to embrace economic empowerment. Because you could very well find yourself out of a job and not do
Exactly.
anything wrong. You know, we live in an age now where the youngest person in the workplace, we're not in the industrial age anymore, it's the information age. The youngest person is the most valuable.
Right.
When I first left home, the older person was the most valuable. They knew what to do if a piece of equipment broke down and
Right,
things
right.
like this. Nowadays, with computer science, if you've been out of school for 5 or 6 years, you're behind the curve.
But I think that's
know?
also something that we can take advantage of, right? So it's like these days, like when I first learned
Well, for the
about
older person, they're more expendable. For the
Right.
younger person, it's more.
so, but even then, if you apply it to your job, you know, staying up to date is very valuable these days.
Yes, I
Having
agree
a
with that.
certification or something that kind of keeps you in that field is very valuable these
Mm-hmm.
days. There are people who don't even go to college and they end up, you know, doing very well for
Yeah,
themselves
coding
because
and
of
such. They have coding
certain types
schools.
of industries allow you to do that. But that also goes into finance, right? So the ability to look up things has never been easier.
Yeah,
The
you're
ability
right.
to study certain objects and certain subjects and understand why things are the way they are has never been easier up until this point in history right now.
Right.
When it comes to investing, I can look up everything I need to know in terms of how to do it, in terms of where to go, in terms of what works best. I can compare different things. That wasn't even around 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah, you're right on that. But you know, the key thing is you can do it, but priming the pump. I
Right.
think that some of these old sayings, it's hard to teach an old dog new tricks.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to get to young people before you start forming all these mental blocks.
Right.
You know, they say the difference between someone who achieves the goals they set and someone who doesn't. Sometimes we see a goal and the obstacle, the hurdle will be so high, we say, I can't do it. Whereas a person who becomes successful, they're dealing with that same obstacle. They say, how can I do it? And that trial and error process, and as you alluded to earlier, failure is not final unless you just stop the first time.
Right.
If you continue going at it, and then if you bring into the equation the perspective of others, preferably others who don't think the same way you do, because if you're kind of come from the same thought process, you know, you may not see something that
Right,
might be
right.
obvious from somewhere else, you know?
I think failure, though, gets harder depending on the situation that you're in. So now you have people, especially those between the ages of about 18 to maybe around 30, 35 years old, who not only do they not want to fail, but they're looking at failure as not really an option because they have other things that have now come into the fold. Student loan debt being a huge thing, right?
Yeah.
Like there's so many people who they have more payments and higher payments than what they make. And so now it's like, well, how can I save? How can I invest? Why would I even want to?
Yeah.
Why would I want to risk losing money when I know I have all this other stuff I have to
Right.
take care of?
Yeah.
And if a family comes in or if somebody gets sick, all of a sudden you have even more to deal with. And I think that is something that's really starting to take a major effect.
Closing down the options
Right.
that not the options people have, but what risk are you willing to
Exactly.
take?
And it becomes very, very hard. If I have to make a choice between making sure that I can eat, making sure that I can pay my loan and pay whatever bills I need, and then saving, it's like most people are going to take making sure they can pay
Take-
everything out.
Take the sure thing, the
Exactly.
most cautious route.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it gets even harder the more, the older you get. It gets even harder when your life starts to move on and you need to get other things and account for other things. If you have a
Those-
child,
some of those
yeah.
factors I mentioned, children,
family,
seniors you're
yep.
taken care of. You know, it's not just you anymore.
Exactly,
There
but
are
what
other
we're
folks
also
depending
finding is
on
that a lot of people are putting their life on hold. So you got a lot of people where, maybe 20, 30 years ago, they may have started at 25. People are waiting until they're 30, 35 to start things. Families, children, house, maybe potentially trying a new career. People are holding off on that. And so it gets to a point where all of a sudden, things like financial independence, things like investing, things like having certain types of savings ladders, that stuff gets pushed to the or not to the forefront, but to the back. It gets pushed all the way to the back. And those things that we have to deal with right now, those are what come to the forefront. And that's the thing that I think is a real
But
tough
I tell you what's
situation.
interesting. I think that what we consider to be that magic age in our society is 30.
Right.
I tell you why. I've had people who've told me in the past, I turned 30, and yeah, I thought by the time I turned 30, yeah, I'd be
Have it all figured
married
out.
and have
Yeah.
2.5 children and
Right.
this and that, and be here in my career and this and that. And I think people, when they're at a younger age, even in their early 30s, they think that I can still achieve these goals I set for myself. I worked so hard going to college, getting training in vocational school, wherever they got it from, and they try to achieve these goals. And what happens is we live in a society where, yes, employers are hiring people, but you're not needed as much. Nowadays, I have 3D printers, I have artificial intelligence, which every few years is getting closer and closer to certain goals that have been set. And so you're getting jobs that really don't allow you to sustain a lifestyle.
Right.
You may need additional jobs. And I think that's why it's very important to discuss this whole concept of defense and voluntary simplicity. Do you really need to have 5 bedrooms right now? You need a place to lay your head and food to eat.
Right.
And once that stability is achieved, you can kind of work toward these other things, but you have to get on first base before you even start thinking about home.
Right.
That's way down the pike. I think we're going to see, as time goes on, a lot more tension between social economic classes, where it becomes more of a them and us type of thing. Oftentimes you get political leaders who will play the front against the middle and bring race into the equation. But you'll find that when it comes to issues that affect us all financially, like healthcare, that affects you whether you're of Asian descent, African descent, or European descent. But you get a lot of times these topics, they take on a more of a racial slant to them. This whole subject of financial management, I've had friends, when I've talked to them about their children, how's your son doing? And I say, oh, he's doing well. He's in college. I hope he does well because his tuition's $75,000 a year, And that's a whole lot to pay back. Most of the time, unless you're in certain fields, you're not going to get a salary commensurate that to allow you to pay that off, and you have other expenses once you come out on top of that.
Right.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Well, I think that's where having a budget comes into key, right?
Right.
You need to have a budget, and you need to understand what money is coming out, like where your money is going. And I think that's also something that we still need to really start to learn and start to understand. Where is our money going? How far is it traveling, right? Do I need to upgrade this, or can I hold on to it for a little bit longer? Can I, live without getting this specific thing? Do I have to get this upgraded?
Right.
Understanding where our money goes is very important. Problem with the financial community is, if I don't know where my money is going and I decide, oh, well, I want to invest something, or I want to put it here and see if it grows. But if I don't know where it's going, all of a sudden it's like, well, no, this is not something I want to partake in. Right. And so again, it comes back to that having something instantaneously. I can put my money here and I will get this back, something tangible. Whereas like
prime example with the where you get the lottery, for
Right.
example. The odds may be 250 million to 1, but you'll see where someone will stand in line every week and buy $30,
for the
$40 worth of
chance,
tickets
they're buying
for
the chance. Yeah.
Whereas you won't put $5 toward buying stock.
But you see,
in a
the
company.
lottery is it's much easier to understand the lottery than it
short-term.
is. Yeah, it's much easier to understand that than it is to understand the stock market. If the lottery, I pay this, I scratch this off, or I choose these numbers, and I have a chance to win this amount. With the stock market, it's like, all right, well, I put my money into this, and I can lose it, or I can't lose it, or it may change to this, or the market goes up and down, so I have this much one day and I have this much another day. There's a lot of stuff that's up in the air. And it's like, maybe I put my money in, but I can't get it back for 3 days, or I have to buy and I have to sell. What's this commission thing? There's a lot to it, a lot more than what you would find for the lottery. So it's easier to understand.
Well, I tell you one thing that I do with a lot of young people that I come in contact with. There's a book called The Richest Man in Babylon.
Right.
This book was written in 1926 by a gentleman named George Clason. He worked in the banking industry. Book is written in parable format, like Aesop's fable, like the Bible. I always recommend that book to parents. I buy the book and give it away to young people.
Right.
When they turn 18, I open them up an account. Used to be a company called Share Builder. They're long since defunct.
They're now E-Trade.
They're E-Trade.
Yeah.
That's right. They sold out to E-Trade.
Yep, or actually sold out to Capital One, and then when Capital One got sold out to E-Trade.
Right, they went to what?
Capital One 36 or ING Direct, and then Capital One.
To Capital One, and Capital One just recently, last month, sold them out to E-Trade.
Right.
But for free, they can set up this account online, name, address, social security number. SEC needs your social security number so they know when you're making money. And then I give them $100 to get them started, to prime the pump. And sit down and work with them and show them how simple it is to go through and do this. And my principle is that every month, the same way that you pay everyone else, take some of that McDonald's money and pay yourself also. There's nothing evil about putting some of your money into things to grow. If you can buy a company's product, their shoes, their burgers, or whatever, you need to also participate in the success they enjoy.
Right.
Do you know, a lot of times people don't understand how that works. Do you know the reason why most companies will go public and offer stock to the public? Could you give an explanation of the reason for that?
Well, one of the reasons that I know they offer it to the public is because the more people that buy it and the more people that put a level of trust into it, usually, the better the company has in terms of getting a lot of public trust. And more times than not, you'll have a situation where they can make more money in the long run. I think one thing that was very important that happened when it was with Facebook. When Facebook was just a regular company, they weren't on the market yet. And all of a sudden, they come out and they say, hey, we're going to actually declare ourselves, we're going to put ourselves on the market. And at the time, everybody thinks, well, oh, it's Facebook, right? Facebook was really in the middle of their growth period. They were rising. And all of a sudden, you had a situation where they were saying, hey, we're going to come out and we're going to put ourselves on the market and see what people can get. And everybody rushed to buy them. Because it's Facebook. People knew it. They thought it was going to be a big deal. But when Facebook came out, all of a sudden, they were trading well below. And I think part of the reason why was because when people started to buy it, they just kind of bought it without really understanding what was going on. And Facebook, being a new company, it wasn't something that people really understood in terms of what to actually do with it. Whereas something like Coca-Cola or something like Disney, which have been around for a longer period of time, it was a lot easier to understand for people who bought something like that. And so I think one of the reasons we have with our investing problems is that people don't know what they're buying. And that has been a thing that has to really be talked about as well. It's not just investing, but it's also knowing what you're buying. Warren Buffett talks about that all the time, actually. I don't buy what I don't know.
Interesting. Well, I tell you, one thing in our communities, especially going back a few generations before, certain people came into our communities, a lot of times they were predatory.
Right.
Selling insurance policies that weren't worth the paper they were written on and everything else, And so we're very risk adverse when it comes down to something that we don't understand. And so we won't put money off into it because of this history. One of the things I found out years ago, I took a business plan class and such. I was thinking about opening automotive repair business at that time. It's one of my hobbies. And one of the instructors, he said, what's the reason for a company offering stock? And he explained to us that when let's say you open a company, you get a loan from the bank. Well, you get this loan, and let's say something you're selling, they also are selling at Walmart.
Right.
The bank may give you 10 years to pay the loan back, but if they break ground within, say, half a mile of where you're at, and they see that Walmart sign, and you're selling some of the same things they're selling, they know that you're not going to win.
Right.
It'd be like me against Mike Tyson, and they want their money back. And they're going to call the loan to us and say, wait a minute, you said 10 years.
Yep.
Yeah, look at the small print, Mr. Thompson. But the money's in my trucks and my equipment and this and that. They'll liquidate your assets to get their money back. When they when you collect money from shareholders who buy your stock, they can't come back and say, hey,
Right.
you can't come back and say, hey, I want my money back. But in order to get you to give up your money, they say, look, this Ford stock, which went down to $1.50 back in 2008, 2009, if you give us some of your money, we're going to use that money to try to grow the company. We also have skin in the game. So if this boat sinks,
Right.
then we're going down with it. But if we do well, you ride our coattails.
So it goes back to that whole, like, they're in it to make money.
Right.
And they're in it to, so when they go public, they have a chance to really make money, but you have the chance to make money with them. And I think that's the thing that really kind of comes to the forefront. One of my earliest stocks that I, really went in on and really decided, all right, I'm going to try this out, was Netflix.
Okay.
And at the time, Netflix was a company where people were like, Netflix? Really? You can stream online and you can watch TV pretty much anywhere? It wasn't something that people thought about. And who was king at the time? Blockbuster. And, people were used to going to places to get their movies and take them out and having to endure late fees and stuff like that. Blockbuster was notorious. Yeah. But I put it into Netflix because I thought it was cool. I didn't even really understand it. That's the craziest thing about it. There are people now who talk about, man, if I could have gone back to Netflix or Amazon or something back in the day, like I really would have. I didn't really understand it, but it was something that was cool to me. And having been a person who was interested in entertainment, that was something I decided to try. And all of a sudden, my money went from, at the time, $21 a share, and then it's like 30, and then it's 40, and then it's 50. And all of a sudden, you start seeing this growth. And it was crazy because we saw what happened with Netflix versus something like Blockbuster. Blockbusters went out of business everywhere.
Right.
And suddenly Netflix was the way to stream and consume media.
They failed to innovate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of like a prime example. That company took off. And because I had gotten in on the ground floor, I kind of took off with it. And that's something I think that we really need to kind of showcase to the community, that it's not just certain people. You have the chance to do it as well. I think that's very important to put forth.
One of the things I want to say, we'll be wrapping up pretty soon. And one thing I definitely want to say, being an ex-military guy, we use time that goes from 001 minute after midnight to 23:59, which is 11:59, just before 12 o'clock. And I plotted out one time what I did with my hours of the day. Most of the time from 6 o'clock or 6:30, you get up in the morning until 8 o'clock when you get back home in the house.
Right.
You're on that treadmill for 45 years of your life, from age, say, 20 to age 65 or even longer.
Right.
You might get 30 days of paid leave per year. That's a script that we've been given that we don't question. Because if you're conditioned at a young age to have that employee mindset, that's what you do. And if you're doing something that you love, then that's great.
Right.
But very often, after the initial excitement of getting a job, people are very frustrated when they get to a point where as life starts to make them, say, more accountable to their responsibilities, they don't have much free time. And that's one of the reasons why, not as much about the money, but just the resource being able to enable a person to achieve some of the goals that you want to achieve in your lifetime, and also being able to just take a break and just enjoy. If you're working all the time for $1, life goes by really fast. You don't realize until years down the pike and you look back. Looking ahead, 40 years looks like a long time in the future. You look back 40 years. So I think it's very important, especially with our younger people, to start now staking out a strategy. And it requires reading. There's certain books that I recommend all the time for reading. One is very important. It's a book written by a gentleman named Napoleon Hill. He wrote a book for Andrew Carnegie. It's called Think and Grow Rich.
Right.
The book is a misnomer. It's not really about thinking and growing rich as it is achieving goals, keeping your goal in your mind's eye. That's a very good book to read. Another one, Robert Kiyosaki, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, where some of the things we're taught, sometimes we're going east looking for a sunset, and we follow it because that's our prime directive. That's what we've been taught, and we don't have any other way of thinking. And so when we're on these courses and things aren't working out for us because sometimes people have agendas don't include you. We don't know what else to do.
Right.
And so you'll see people going, I've seen people go through psychological trauma on the job. You know, you get to a point by the time they're a certain age, they realize it's not going to happen.
Right.
You know, they didn't realize there were glass ceilings or ceilings based on their gender.
Right.
Things like this.
And it comes into play. Most people, unfortunately, are not happy with their job and they're not happy with the income that they're making. So I think it really is upon us to really try and find out other ways to do so.
Well, Jonathan, I just want to say it's been a pleasure talking to you. It's good to see some positive young people. There are, you know, generations out there. Well, I say positive, I mean not accepting defeat. But I think it's important. I think that you also have a task to talk to some of your peers and work with folks just to also illustrate to them some of the things that they can do to help themselves achieve goals that they set. You know, where would you suggest young people to go to get started? We've got like a few minutes to go, about 2 minutes.
You know, one of the things I think that people should really do is take advantage of the internet. We have it, use it. You know, don't just use it for certain things like entertainment or you know, trying to figure out what the next thing you can buy. Use it to gain information as well. Things like Investopedia, which will teach you the basics of investing and what to really look for when you're first getting started. Things like Market Watch, which is a website that pretty much follows trends and has different articles about money. There's plenty of personal blog sites where you may find somebody who has been in a certain life situation that's very much like your own, and they may have written about how they got out of it. And it's not to say that you will have the same situation, but you get to see somebody who's been through it, so it makes a little bit more sense to you in that regard.
Okay.
You know, and then your basic news sites, take advantage, see what's out there, see what companies are doing what. See, you know, who's buying what, where you might be able to put your money in, and really think about saving. There's a lot out there to consume if you're just willing to look for it.
Well, Mr. Clark, it's been a pleasure talking to you. You know, you just said something that comes to mind. There's an organization called NIFTY. You ever heard of them?
I was in NIFTY when I was younger, yes.
National Foundation for Teaching Entrepreneurship. One of their mottos is, we teach young people, if you can't find a job, make one.
Right.
So there are a lot of resources. Well, Mr. Clark, I want to say it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Pleasure's mine.
And thank you very much for coming and sharing your ideas with us on Africa's Vision Network.
Appreciate it.
Certainly appreciate the conversation.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. And my name is Raymond Thompson, and this has been Africa's Vision Network. Thank you for viewing our show this week.